Idea group rankings. Some are good, others are worse, and some are a thing. But it's okay, because I rank things. The issue is when I could go do a 1 hour long video explaining in excruciating detail, while you and your favorite content creators are objectively wrong, and breaking down into insane details, where apparently that is not a good idea from the not being an asshole book of thought, and yet we still have a military idea group ranking in front of us. So how have I achieved this feat? Well, it turns out if you outsource the actual rankings to someone that hasn't played Europa Universalis since his Ryuku World Conquest back in the Europa Universalis 3 days, you'll have a flawless plan with zero flaws at all, introducing the one and only Suede Civ 3, a master of things civilization, and an absolute monster at Civilization 3 specifically. I love his stuff, he makes great things, and I'm very happy to bring him on today to create this objectively correct zero room for error ranking with zero flaws. And before we get into that, just the usual things out the way. A like and it would be appreciated, and a subscription would be amazing. Pterodactyl remains ahead, but the hopium for 25k remains real. Let's go get there. For we must win. Anyway, enough self-shilling. Without further ado, Swade himself.
Hey guys, I'm excited to be here, giving you guys the official tier list of EU4 idea groups.
Well, it's time to begin. No one can claim me for doing bad rankings, because they're coming from Swade, which makes them perfect. And of course, we're going to begin right away with aristocratic ideas. That's the first one on the list, and alphabetically and everything else.
Okay, so I'm saying noble knights, so cavalry ability. So you said cavalry ability, that's like attack damage, did you say?
Yes, so combat ability increases, in this case, would increase the damage dealt by cavalry by 15%, but unlike some other modifiers we'll see, does not decrease the damage the cavalry themselves will take.
Okay, in EU3, there weren't a ton of troop types, if I remember correctly. It was pretty much just infantry and cavalry, maybe a couple others. Is it the same way in EU4?
So yes, there is just 3 infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and there's like unique units, but those are still always a form of cavalry, infantry, and artillery as well.
Okay, so that's reasonably strong. Manpower and then minus development costs, those both sound like very good things to have. Cavalry to infantry ratio. Interesting. Oh, but then the cavalry become cheaper. Okay. Yearly army tradition decay. Pronoia. What is a pronoia, lemon cake?
So this was the thing that I flagged immediately, but I thought it was probably best to leave for the video. There's different types of subjects in the game, so you can have your normal vassals, your personal unions, and so on. And Byzantium gets a unique type of subject that they get called pronoias. I still don't know how to pronounce them specifically. Now, those pronoias are limited. You can only have a certain amount of them, and only if you're playing Byzantium, and only if you've unlocked the government reform that gives you access to this vassal, will this do anything, which will give you +1 number of those possible pronoias. If you are not Byzantium or have not unlocked that government reform, this does literally nothing. You only get the -1 Yeti army and navy tradition decay.
Okay, then you get a diplomat and -10% to general costs. You get fabricating claims. This is a little late in the tree for fabricating claims, and then minus costs on unjustified demands. Or sorry, minus unjustified demands. Then less autonomy change and more yearly absolutism. And then at the end, you get +1 leader siege. Is the bonus like what's bonus? Sorry.
Sorry.
Is that like a bonus for completing the tree?
So when you take the final thing, in this case local nobility, you get both the local nobility and then you get the bonus as well. So technically, the last one you take here, local nobility, will unlock both the local nobility and the bonus.
Okay, and then the Raj puts the nobility. Some factions would not get access to that, right?
So I would say the vast majority of factions have access to the nobility, church, and merchants. Usually it's an exception if you don't have access to those 3. And the Rajput and the Marathas are just versions of the nobility that certain factions have instead of the nobility. So it's basically nobility, but different color of nobility, if that makes sense.
Okay, so what I'm seeing here is there's some strong ideas at the start of the tree, and then some solid stuff at the end. I think overall I would put this at the top end of the solid tier.
Okay.
I think you don't have to go that deep to get the powerful stuff here. There might be some stuff in the middle that could be a bit situational, but overall it would be a good choice, I think.
That makes sense, and so aristocratic has entered a solid tier. With that, though, an aristocratic completed, we are moving on to divine.
Okay, cheaper development costs. Oh, I like those. +1 to yearly devotion. What is devotion?
So, monarchies get what's called legitimacy as their main firm of how legitimate your rule is. Republics get republican tradition, and theocracies, their method of how their right to rule, as it were, is their devotion to whatever faith they practice. So this servant of God initial opener gives you +1 yearly devotion. Devotion goes on a scale between 0 and 100, and if it's really low, you get debuffs, and if it's really high, you get buffs.
Okay, great. Fire damage received. Where do you receive fire damage?
In combat in EU4 is split into two phases, the shock phase and the fire phase. So when two troops meet, they take a shot at each other. That is the fire phase. Then it's followed by the shock phase, where they engage in hand-to-hand combat, after which the troops just agree they're actually going to go back to the fire phase, and then and they kind of take a step back and shoot at each other again, before yet again coming back in for hand-to-hand combat. This repeats until a battle is resolved. So basically half the combat phases in the game are going to be in the fire phase, the other are going to be in the shock phase.
So half the phases, but what percentage of the damage would you say would be fire damage?
So it depends on the phase of the game and depends against what kind of army you're coming up against. Someone may make by later stages of EU4, and this might become into the more personal opinions, but by later stages of EU4, you're going to have more cannons, and cannons are going to get better, so the fire damage will become dominant. And in the early game, there's a lot more hand-to-hand combat with pikeman units instead of musketmen, of course, and other units will be more prevalent that are more specialized on shock damage.
Okay, I see. And you have to take that pretty early. Okay, next up is -10 to leader costs and cost of reducing 33% to cost of reducing war exhaustion. Okay, and then -10% to morale damage. Good. -10% to cultural conversion cost and enforcing religion through war at -30%. -2% national unrest. Am I crazy for thinking that's pretty good? Oh no, you can't tell me. Sorry. But national unrest that like affects like your ability to get like rebellions and stuff like that, and the stability of your empire.
Not sure how that affects how that was translated in EU3, but in EU4 super early on, I was aware that the way unrest worked was you'd have a percentage uprising chance, like you'd have a 5% chance of uprising, and then 5% of the time that would just happen. So within that context, -2 unrest would obviously seem very strong, but unrest was reworked within, I won't say even later EU4, but probably around a third of the EU4 cycle. And the reason I mention this is because I'm not sure what the system was for EU3, where instead what would happen is you'd have a province would just exist on 0 unrest, and you'd get reductions to unrest. For example, having 3 stability would give you -3 unrest everywhere, but obviously that was hard to maintain. But what would happen is certain things and certain developments would increase the amount of unrest being generated by a province. So let's say you just conquered a province, you get 30 years of separatism, which would give you +15 unrest on that province. And what that would mean is that a province that has positive unrest would then contribute progress towards a rebel faction, which would then rise up. So if you have loads of unrest, if your country's fallen apart, -2 unrest isn't going to stop it falling apart. But if you make a build around stacking unrest, you can prevent a lot of rebellions indirectly. And also, if you have just a little bit of unrest, like a little bit of civil results, you've taken away a couple civil liberties, but not too much, this may be able to prevent an uprising.
I see. Okay, and then martyrs, we have manpower in true faith provinces, could be quite strong, and prestige from land battles. And then as a bonus, you get missionary strength versus heretics, clergy loyalty, and Brahmins equilibrium. There's definitely some strong fundamental stuff here, so I would put it maybe slightly below aristocracy within the solid tier.
Okay, and there it goes. Understandable, fascinating choices so far, and with that we move on to the Horde government, available only to tribes that have embraced the government reform for steppe nomads, the Great Mongol State, or the Sikrada build, which is a very special, unique thing. Don't worry about it.
Okay. -33% to cavalry cost, 10% to cavalry to infantry ratio. That seems pretty busted. -10% to aggressive expansion impact. Could be pretty good. +25% to religious unity. Not sure about that. Land attrition. 20% is a big bonus too. So I could see that being quite strong. -1 to national unrest and +0.5 to yearly horde unity. What is horde unity?
So in the same way that divine governments use devotion for the measure of their right to rule and legitimacy for aristocratic, hordes have a mechanic called horde unity, which is, out of every single one of the governments, is probably the hardest to actively maintain. unless you're expanding very quickly, in which case it becomes trivial to maintain.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Then caravan power sounds
Mhm.
good. Caravans. Everyone likes trade. +2 max promoted cultures.
Mhm.
Good. And then bonus cavalry combat ability and tribes loyalty equilibrium. Okay, especially with these strong bonuses at the start, I think this is an absolutely busted idea in EU4.
Understandable. And we have our first absolutely busted S tier entry. And with that, we move on to the indigenous idea group.
Great. So bountiful land, -5% to development cost. We've seen a lot of development costs, so it gives us some way to compare them directly.
Mhm.
A little bit to tribal development growth. Could you explain that to me? I know, like, I played some games as like Native American factions in EU3, and I believe they called it Westernization,
Ah,
somewhat
not
oddly. The idea of like developing your nation. So
so.
how would that work in EU?
Westernization has been
EU4?
replaced by an entirely different mechanic that's done with institutions and a lot of other things going on now. It's gone. Tribal development is, ironically enough, is pretty self-explanatory in the sense that it is just how developed your tribe is. As this number ticks up, you're able to expand your tribe into other provinces and just gain bonuses and other things. In general, this is a good thing. And tribal development is one of those things as well where it's not that trivial to get as well. But there aren't that many things that give you bonuses to tribal development growth.
I see. Would this be compared to other bonuses? Would this be a big number or would this be a small number?
It's hard to say, but I think the best way of saying it is it's not as small as it seems initially, but it's not a big amount as well.
Fair. Okay. Attrition for enemies. Okay. The Great Law. Reform progress modifier.
Mhm.
Okay. Morale. Then national manpower, but that's 15% to national manpower. And I believe we saw manpower before.
We did for
So
divine,
the religious one had manpower in True Faith provinces and then in other bonuses.
and
Interesting. Okay.
aristocratic had 15 as well, just also globally.
I see. Okay. And then -10% idea cost. So these are
Mhm.
ideas, right?
Yes, these cost
Okay,
you.
so you can max out this tree and then do the other trees.
Mhm.
-% to 20% to province war score cost
Yep.
and institution spread.
Institutions, sorry,
Okay,
are the mechanic that replaces the westernization thing.
I see. Okay, great. So yeah, this seems like a no-brainer trait. Let's put it maybe slightly below the horde.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as an indigenous civ, this would be a no-brainer to max out first for them,
Nope,
unless
makes
there's
sense.
something really strong about to come up.
Understandable. Well, we are moving on to plutocratic, available only for republics or noble elite reforms, which are not very popular to be
Okay,
honest.
so -20% to mercenary costs. Now remember as small factions in I might be thinking of Crusader Kings, where
Mhm.
like you wouldn't really have much in terms of standing armies, and so you'd rely a lot on mercenaries. Is that still true here? If you're playing like a one province minor, or would you have more access to standing armies here?
It really depends on the build that you're doing, and I think for small nations especially, they should certainly be utilizing mercenaries more. As a small nation can get away without mercenaries, but then you have to be really careful about the fights you're taking because you are going to struggle more with
Mhm.
recovering the manpower because you have less access to it naturally. However, you can also absolutely
So
ignore
just
mercenaries by just not being stupid with your battles.
of course, yeah.
Mhm.
So just what I'm saying right off the bat, it also gives a bonus to regiment cost, which could also be reasonably strong. I think this has like a strong potential to be used to cheese things. Like if you are very good with how you recruit the mercenaries and like which provinces you take and how you manage things in battles,
Mhm.
having those right at the start of the tree could be quite strong. Then you have army morale, but also national unrest reduction, so that's good. Monthly reform progress, that seems very good. +1 free merchant.
I'd like to also
Um,
just, sorry to interrupt, but highlight how, when we saw earlier with the Great Law for Indigenous, given 25% to monthly reform progress growth, Bill of Rights gives you a flat 0.1 monthly reform progress instead, which of course means that other modifiers to percentages modify 0.1 instead of being another percentage increase, which I think is probably worth highlighting.
okay, so flat as opposed to percentage.
Yes.
Okay, +1 merchant. How good are individual merchants in EU4?
Unfortunately, it's going to be such a massive it depends answer because there are certain environments where you have too many merchants and you're like, well, I can't really
Trade
use them.
nodes.
Yes, so you have to put one into each trade
So
node.
you're telling me if we had a game where they're like every single province was its own trade node, that merchants would have like varying levels of
Actually, in that environment,
power?
they'll be entirely useless because I didn't make any of the trade nodes connect to each other, as merchants only, basically for the most part, only steer. In some cases, they do give you a little bit of an
Okay.
extra boost to trade power, but the point is there's also a trade range, so if another trade node is just too far away, even if you have the merchant, you can't send it there.
So if you were playing like, let's say, I don't know, Genoa or Venice, 1400 start, how many merchants would you typically have access to at this point in the game?
So just at starting of the game, you would just have the default amount. I'm trying to now remember, rather embarrassing. I believe it's 3 that you start with. I'm trying to think of why it wouldn't be. No, I think it is 3 that you start with. It's just there's a little voice in my head that's
For
saying
all
it's 2
factions or for,
for all factions.
sorry, for all, okay.
It's
Okay.
very rare to get an extra
Um,
merchant, but the other thing to also bear in mind is if you are building very much around trade and you build things called trade companies, those give you a merchant for each trade company. So it's if you need merchants, you can get them, and as well as a colony. So if I have a big enough colony, it will give me 1 extra merchant. So any colonial nation that has 10 provinces or more, which a lot of them get to that point, will provide a merchant as well. So it's one of those merchants
Makes
are one
sense.
of those things where if you really need them, you can get them.
Okay, but it seems like just a solid bonus you can't go wrong with. Like it wouldn't be useless.
Very rarely is it useless. I think it's a
Um,
good way of putting it.
okay. So plus 10% goods produced modifier.
Mm-hmm.
Are these like trade goods within your individual
I
cities?
so goods produce when there are 2 forms of income: tax income and also production income. And then the production income affects your trade income as well because your trade value is based on the production of the goods inside. So things like China will generate more trade value than something like Madagascar, and so goods produced affects
See.
the base value of production. So a 5 development province will produce 1 base goods produced per year. If you have 3 subjects and no other bonuses to goods produced, you'll produce 1.1 base instead.
Okay. So then we have free cities with caravan power and development cost, manpower recovery speed plus 20%. That seems very, very strong. And then, especially like towards the end of the tree, like you'd probably getting more into standing armies at that point where you need to refresh your army. And then at the end, plus 25% trade power in owned provinces and then some loyalty bonuses. I think this is busted. I'm going to put it at the top of the absolutely busted tier above hordes.
Understandable. Plutocratic going to absolutely busted tier. And with that, we are going to
Okay.
be very rapidly moving over to defensive.
So, plus 100% army tradition from battles. Morale of armies, that could be quite strong. Land leader maneuver. What is land leader maneuver?
Generals in EU4 have 4 types of pips associated with them. Fire pips, which impacts the damage that the general does in the fire phase. Shock pips, which impacts the damage they do in the shock phase. Maneuver pips, which for each point of maneuver you gain plus 5% movement speed. Also, if you have a higher maneuver general and you do a river crossing, normally you'd have a river crossing penalty. If I had, let's say both of our generals had the same maneuver, or your general had a higher maneuver than mine, and I attacked you over a river. However, if my general has more maneuver than your general and I attack you over a river, I don't take the river crossing penalty. Outside of that, it's just 5% movement speed and no river crossing penalties sometimes. And the siege pip, which makes you siege faster. This gives you 1 extra,
So,
all your
movement
generals
speed
just
would.
gain an extra maneuver pip. Sorry.
I remember combat in EU3 being a lot of like whack a mole, like putting down small armies with your big army. I could see why combat speed would be, or sorry, movement speed would be quite strong, but you said it's just a 5% bonus
Per
plus the
pip.
river crossing thing?
So that you can have up to 6 maneuver pips unless you mod the game, but we're not going to be talking about that here. So you can
Oh,
get up to
one pip would give you
30%,
5%.
but each 1 pip gives you 5%. So a 6 maneuver general will have 30% movement speed,
Okay.
which is starting to become significant. But the other thing to bear in mind is that the way EU4 rolls generals is that it will give you a general when you hire a general, and then whatever that general was, they will just get an extra +1 maneuver slapped on top of their stats from this ability.
Mm-hmm. Could it be like taken away by the cap? Like if you already have a 6 maneuver general?
Yes, if you roll a 6 maneuver general and you get this bonus, this does nothing as you cannot go over the cap.
Okay, interesting. Good. So land maintenance modifier, regiment power usage, both minus 5%. Seeing some small numbers here. Minus 10% to fort maintenance and plus 25% to fort defense. Seems kind of mid. Plus 30% to reinforce speed. That's
Yes.
pretty late in the tree. I could see it being a solid bonus. plus 30%, 3% to garrison size. This is like the size of your sieged cities. Like if the enemy is sieging you, like just the
The troops
intrinsic
inside the fort.
defenders you would have.
Yes, absolutely. It's the troops inside the fort. It
Okay.
also means, obviously, if they decide to assault the fort, then that's the amount of troops defending.
So this is a thing in Civilization 2 where generally bonuses to defense are just generally not as good. Like if you're defending, you're losing, right? So things like morale of armies, obviously you could use that offense and defense equally. But things like garrison size and forts, like you probably shouldn't be playing your game around getting sieged in your fort. And then at the end, we have attrition for enemy and then max attrition for enemy. Now, attrition is very strong. And maybe if you got like caught off guard with a bad war, if you could like stretch it out to like make them take penalties, maybe it would help you beat a faction you otherwise couldn't. But I don't think that's like a game breaking bonus. I'm going to put this at the top of the bad tier, I think.
Fair enough. That's going to be some fun comments. And with that, we move on to naturally mercenary ideas.
Okay. Oh, we got mercenary costs right off the bat.
Yep. As you may be able to see, just also heads
military
up
advisor.
over stacking. If I have both mercenary and plutocratic, my mercenaries are now 45% cheaper. It is a additive multiplication bonus. Sorry, do continue.
You don't have to like max out one tree to switch to the other, right? You can just like take one idea and then
you can have up to 8 idea groups, and if you want to take as many military ones throughout the campaign, you can have up to 4 military idea groups with the normal settings. You can turn this off and have 8 military idea groups if you want as well, but the default settings for the game mean that you'll be able to, if you want to take both mercenary and plutocratic or take 2 idea groups, you'll need to be 3 idea groups in.
Okay, I see. So it wouldn't be super useful for choosing then with the combination, but it could be mid-game if you're using a mercenary strategy, it could be strong. Then you have military advisor costs, and you can recruit mercenaries from anywhere. Interesting. Mercenary maintenance, okay. And then minus military trick technology cost. I could see, yeah, how this would have a lot of synergy with Republic or the plutocratic one. Cheap military tax, good. Minus 50% war tax costs, and plus 50% mercenary leader army tradition modifier. Those sound pretty weak. Plus 10% infantry combat ability. That's a lot of your army is infantry, especially if you're not going for like hordes or aristocracy. And you can choose, like if you're getting mercenary, you could choose infantry mercenaries. So that could be pretty strong. And then the second ability too, plus 30% mercenary manpower, and then discipline. I'm gonna put this at the bottom of solid tier.
Okay.
Like these seem pretty situational. Definitely a good idea. Thank you, Paradox, for that. Okay, next up is naval. So +1 naval leader shock, -1%, or sorry, -1 landing penalty, plus 25% galley combat ability. And you get naval leader fire, and then reduced morale hit when losing a ship. Plus 1% Navy tradition. I'm guessing there might be some like spillover effects from Navy tradition onto like other impacts of the game, like maybe with trade or colonization. So this might not just be military. Sailor recovery speed and Marine forces limit. So these seem to be, I think naval bonuses inherently could be pretty strong in EU4, but what I'm seeing here is a lot of these are specifically for naval combat. Ideally, what you'd want, you don't want to be like playing your game under the assumption that you're going to be losing a bunch of boats and losing a bunch of manpower at sea. Like when you're doing battles at land, that's like a cost of doing business for taking things, but battles at sea, really, you want to get there ideally with no losses if possible. So heavy ship combat ability, ship durability, morale of navies, and plus 10% global engagement. And then cheaper naval barrage cost or ship disengagement chance. Now, it really depends on the strength of these bonuses. If these bonuses are so strong that you can just wreck other nations at sea, if you have taken this tree, I could see it being strong. But I'm not really seeing anything that could like help out your. A lot of these are like buffs to your core economy. A lot of these other abilities, and these ones are all just kind of niche stuff that seem very situational. So I think I would put this at the bottom of bad tier.
Understandable. Naval at the bottom of bad tier. Good to know. I'll bear that in mind. And with that, we move on to offensive.
Okay, so we have bayonet leaders with +1 leader shock for land leaders. Then we have faster recruitment time. Now, in defensive, we had... Oh, that was reinforced speed in defensive. Okay, that's a little different.
Indeed it is.
But the numbers seem to... Okay, next we have land leader fire. And then prestige from land battles and pronoi. Oh my god, don't make me say it. Then we have siege ability, plus 20%, your cores. Then we have plus 5% discipline.
You did miss
land
Grand
force,
Army, sorry. For land force
I did, yeah.
Units.
Land force limit modifier, and then special unit cost. That could be pretty strong for a lot of factions. And then the bonuses, recovery, army morale speed, and then loyalty for 1.
So the Kizbalash are the Persian government very specifically gets a unique type of nobility, but that nobility is split into 3 separate factions instead of 1, and one of those 3 factions is the Kizbalash.
I see. So what I'm seeing here is if you take this and you get the first three policies, you just would straight up immediately get a lot of not a lot, but like solid bonuses to your capabilities in direct combat with the enemy. And I think that will always be strong if you just need a flat bonus to your combat. So I would put this at the top of the solid tier.
Understandable. So offensive will be going to the top of solid tier, and we now move on to our final 2 entries for quality and quantity. Let's begin with quality.
Okay, infantry combat ability at plus 10%. That's fine. Plus yearly army tradition and navy tradition. What kind of things can you... I probably should have asked this earlier, but what can you buy with army tradition or navy tradition?
So,
is it like mana?
Army and navy tradition sits on a scale between 0 and 100, where 0 means you have none of it, and 100 means you get the most of it. Based on the amount you have, you gain different bonuses. So, just right away, if you have 100 army tradition, you gain 25% morale of armies, as well as other bonuses. But it decays at a rate of 5%. So if you have 100 tradition, you will lose 5% of it per year. And if you have 20 army tradition, you'll lose 1 of it a year, because the base decay is 5%. So bonuses like quality education let you fight that decay, but notice that the decay gets smaller over time. So a 0.5 yearly army tradition would mean that you actually have an equilibrium, a new one of 10 instead of 0 now.
I see. So basically, if you're fighting wars just constantly throughout the campaign, you're probably going to have maxed out in the stat anyway. If you're very rarely fighting wars, it would probably decay down pretty quickly anyway, or before your next war. But if you're in the middle where you're fighting intermittent wars, this could be pretty solid.
Sorry, another thing
cavalry
to
combat
very
ability.
quickly mention with army tradition, because this is also a big one. Between 0 and 20 and 20 and 40 and like 40 and 60, and every 20 gap, you gain better generals whenever you roll generals, and same for navy, you get better admirals. So the base stats of your admirals and your generals increases based on how good your army tradition is.
Okay, I see. Okay, then we have cavalry ability, ship durability, morale of navies, naval attrition reduced. End of this tree is looking kind of mid. Artillery combat ability, like I guess that's fine. And then the bonus is plus 5% to discipline, and then the loyalty ability for Zern factions, right?
Yes.
For the Ottomans, and then...
So the Gilman are one of the other faction for the Persians. That's not the Kizbalash, that their nobility split into 3. That's the one of the second of the 3.
Seems pretty bad. Let's put it... there's some... At the start, there's like some solid stuff that seems like it could be useful. I think if you're just picking out the... I'd put it at the top of... Now, this seems worse than defensive. I'll put it below defensive and bad tier.
Understandable. All right. Okay, and with that, we move on to quantity.
Okay. Manpower recovery speeds at the second tier. The first tier would be national manpower modifier, plus 33%. That could be very strong. Then you have minus 10% regiment cost, plus 33% national supply limit modifier, minus 33% reinforcement costs, minus 25% land attrition, minus 5% land maintenance modifier, and plus 33, another plus 33% to land force limit modifier.
Yes.
No, that hasn't been had yet. Well, now you get it. And then plus 1 possible pronoias. Those are everywhere, so we'll just ignore them. This seems pretty busted to me. Let's put it... we'll put it above plutocratic at the top of absolutely busted. Just having more troops can't hurt.
Yeah, that's indeed one of the. It does make sense as a take. All right, there we go. So just to confirm, you have put quantity, plutocratic, horde, and indigenous in the absolutely busted tier.
Oh, I haven't put them there. That's where they are.
Oh, it does make sense. It does check out.
Yeah, this is the official rankings. Yeah.
We have offensive, aristocratic, divine, and mercenary in solid, and as we all know, defensive, quality, and naval are all bad. All right,
yes,
perfect.
That is how the game is balanced.
That does make sense.
I'm glad
the gospel truth.
I'm glad I could educate your viewers. I've heard your viewers are very interested in this topic, so I wanted to give them a chance to know the truth.
Yeah, a lot of people really get this wrong and have a lot of incorrect opinions, so I'm really happy we can set the record straight on that one. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, take care. Make sure to like and subscribe to the video. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. If you want my takes on another type of idea group, let us know. Cheers.
Of course. And make sure you check out Swade as well. He's got some amazing content. Well, that was one of the rankings of all time. If you disagree, sorry, you are wrong. This is the objective truth. So, all quality enjoyers, it's so over for you. No more quality meta. We're all opening aristocratic now. Jokes aside, do make sure to check Swade out if you have any interest within Civ games or want to see, frankly, a lemon level, if not greater, analysis of Civ 3 specifically. But that is all I have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all of my YouTube members, especially Ark, Solar, Solemon, W Haste, and Sebastian Haller.